What if the most powerful being in the galaxy was sitting alone in a human coffee shop, forgotten by his own empire, and the only person who showed him kindness was a broke college student who just wanted to share a cup of coffee? Sometimes the smallest acts of human compassion can reshape the fate of entire civilizations. Sometimes a simple, "would you like some company?" can mean the difference between galactic war and unprecedented peace. And sometimes the lonely stranger you offer your last $5 to buy a warm drink might just be the emperor of 1,000 worlds who has been searching the universe for something he thought was extinct: genuine kindness without expectation of reward. This is the story of Marcus Chun, a third-year engineering student who couldn't afford his textbooks, but could afford to care about a sad-looking lizard creature sitting alone in the rain. This is also the story of Zephyros the Eternal, Supreme Emperor of the Draconic Hegemony, who controlled more star systems than humans had discovered, yet couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him how his day was going. What happens when these two worlds collide over a simple cup of coffee? What happens when humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology, our weapons, or our strategic minds, but our inexplicable need to offer friendship to anyone who looks like they need it? The galaxy is about to find out. The rain fell in steady sheets across the university district, turning the autumn afternoon into a gray watercolor painting that bled at the edges. Marcus Chun pulled his second-hand jacket tighter around his shoulders as he jogged between the buildings of Syracuse University, his backpack bouncing against his spine with each hurried step. The weather forecast had promised sunshine, but weather forecasts, like most things in Marcus's life lately, had proven unreliable. He ducked into Cosmic Grounds, the small independent coffee shop that had become his second home during the brutal final weeks of the semester. The familiar smell of roasted beans and cinnamon hit him like a warm embrace, and he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. The shop was nearly empty, which wasn't surprising given the weather and the late hour. Most students were either buried in the library or had already given up and gone home to binge-watch Netflix instead of studying for finals. Marcus checked his phone and winced. 3 missed calls from his mother, 2 text messages from his study group asking where he was, and 1 notification from his banking app that he really didn't want to open. He had exactly $37.62 to last him until his next shift at the campus bookstore, which wasn't until Monday. Rent was due in 4 days, and he was still short by about $200. The barista, a sophomore named Jenny who was working her way through art school just like half the staff, looked up from wiping down the espresso machine. "The usual, Marcus?" "Just a small coffee today," he said, fishing crumpled bills from his pocket. "Black." Jenny raised an eyebrow. Marcus was known for his elaborate coffee orders, the kind of complicated drinks that kept him caffeinated through 18-credit semesters and 30-hour work weeks. "You sure? No triple-shot caramel macchiato with extra foam?" "Watching the budget this week," Marcus replied with what he hoped was a casual shrug. "Besides, I'm trying to appreciate the simple things in life." Jenny rang him up, and Marcus handed over a $5 bill, one of his last. As he waited for his change, he glanced around the shop and noticed something odd in the corner booth. There was someone sitting there, hunched over a cup of something steaming, but they didn't look like any student Marcus had ever seen. The figure was tall, even sitting down, with an elongated frame that seemed almost reptilian. Their skin had an unusual texture, like it was covered in very fine scales that caught the light in interesting ways. Most striking were their eyes, which seemed to be an unusual golden color that almost seemed to glow in the dim lighting of the coffee shop. They wore what looked like an expensive coat, but it hung on their frame in a way that suggested they weren't used to human clothing. What struck Marcus most, though, was how alone they looked. The figure sat perfectly still, staring into their cup with an expression that transcended species barriers. It was the look of someone who had nowhere to go and no one waiting for them. Marcus collected his coffee and his change, then found himself walking toward the corner booth instead of his usual table by the window. He'd always been terrible at minding his own business, a trait his mother attributed to having been raised by his grandmother, who believed that kindness was a moral obligation rather than a casual suggestion. "Excuse me," Marcus said, stopping a respectful distance from the table. "I don't want to bother you. but you look like you could use some company. Would you mind if I sat with you?" The figure looked up, and Marcus felt a small shock run through him. Up close, those golden eyes were definitely not human, and there was an intelligence in them that seemed ancient and profound. For a moment, Marcus wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. But then he saw something else in those eyes, something that looked very much like surprise. "You wish to sit with me?" The voice was deep and resonant, with an accent Marcus couldn't place. It sounded like English was a second language, but one the speaker had mastered with careful precision. "If that's okay with you," Marcus said. "I'm Marcus, by the way. I'm a regular here, and I've never seen you before." The figure was quiet for a long moment, as if considering whether this was some kind of trap. Finally, they gestured to the seat across from them. "I am." Another pause, longer this time. "You may call me Zeph." Marcus slid into the booth and took a sip of his coffee, which was stronger than usual and exactly what he needed. "Nice to meet you, Zeph. Are you new to Syracuse? I don't think I've seen you around campus." "I am visiting," Zeph said carefully. "I'm not familiar with your customs here. I was not certain if this establishment was appropriate for someone like me." "Someone like you?" Marcus tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Zeph gestured vaguely at himself, and Marcus realized he was referring to his obviously non-human appearance. It struck Marcus as odd that someone would be self-conscious about that in 2157, when first contact with 17 different species had been established over the past 30 years. Sure, it was still unusual to see non-humans on Earth, especially outside of the major diplomatic centers, but it wasn't unheard of. "Oh, you mean because you're not human?" Marcus shrugged. "That's no big deal. I mean, you're probably the first draconic person I've met in person, but we get exchange students from all over the galaxy. The physics department has 3 Centaurians and 2 Andromedans this semester." Something flickered across Zeph's face at the word draconic, but Marcus didn't catch it, focused as he was on taking another sip of his coffee. "You are not concerned?" Zeph asked. "My appearance does not disturb you?" Marcus looked at him more carefully, taking in the scaled skin, the elongated features, the way his fingers ended in what were definitely claws, albeit well-maintained ones. "Should it? I mean, you seem nice enough. You're drinking coffee and sitting quietly. You haven't bothered anyone or tried to conquer the planet or anything." That last comment seemed to strike Zeph as particularly funny, though he tried to hide what might have been a smile. "No, I have not tried to conquer your planet. See, you're already ahead of most of the politicians I know." Marcus grinned. "So what brings you to Syracuse? Are you studying here, or just passing through?" Zeph was quiet for another long moment, staring into his cup again. "I am taking time to think, to observe. I have been traveling for some time, trying to understand different cultures, different ways of life." "That sounds amazing," Marcus said, and he meant it. "I've never been off planet. Hell, I've barely been out of New York State. What's it like out there?" "Vast," Zeph said simply, "and often very lonely." There was something in the way he said it that made Marcus's heart ache a little. He'd been feeling pretty sorry for himself lately, what with the financial stress and the academic pressure and the general uncertainty about what he was going to do with his life. But sitting across from someone who had seen the galaxy and still felt alone put his problems into perspective. "Well," Marcus said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast, "here's to finding good company when you need it most." Zeph looked at the gesture with curiosity, then carefully lifted his own cup and touched it gently to Marcus's. The drink inside looked like tea rather than coffee, something herbal and green that smelled faintly of mint and something else Marcus couldn't identify. "An interesting ritual," Zeph observed. "It's called a toast," Marcus explained. "We do it to mark special occasions or to honor something. In this case, I'm honoring the fact that 2 strangers found each other on a rainy Thursday afternoon." "2 strangers," Zeph repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose that is what we are." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the rain streak down the windows. Marcus found himself studying his companion more carefully, noting details he'd missed before. Zeph's clothing was definitely expensive, made from materials that seemed to shift and shimmer slightly in the light. His hands, despite ending in claws, moved with a careful grace that spoke of education and refinement. Most intriguingly, there was a small pendant hanging from a chain around his neck that seemed to be made of some kind of metal Marcus didn't recognize, inscribed with symbols that definitely weren't from any Earth language. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said finally. "Of course. Are you okay? I mean, you look pretty sad when I first saw you sitting here. I don't want to pry, but sometimes it helps to talk about stuff." Zeph's golden eyes met his, and for a moment, Marcus felt like he was being evaluated in some way that went far beyond normal social interaction. It was like being examined by someone who was used to reading people's motivations and finding them wanting. "I am processing some difficult decisions," Zeph said finally. "I have responsibilities that require me to be someone I am not certain I wish to be." Marcus nodded. "I get that. I mean, maybe not on the same scale, but I definitely understand feeling trapped by expectations. My parents want me to be an engineer because it's stable and pays well. My professors want me to pursue graduate school because they think I'm smart enough. My boss wants me to work more hours because I'm reliable. Sometimes I feel like everyone knows who Marcus Chun should be except Marcus Chun. And who would you choose to be if the choice were entirely yours?" The question caught Marcus off guard. It was the kind of deep, philosophical inquiry that he usually only encountered in late-night conversations with his roommate after too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But something about Zeph's manner suggested he was genuinely interested in the answer. "I think I want to be someone who helps people," Marcus said slowly. "Not in a grand, save-the-world way, but in small, everyday ways. Maybe I'd open a community center, or teach kids, or work for one of those organizations that helps refugees get settled." "I know it sounds naive." "It does not sound naive," Zeph said quietly. "It sounds hopeful. What about you? If you could be anyone, what would you choose?" Zeph was quiet for so long that Marcus started to worry he'd overstepped somehow. Finally, his companion spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I would choose to be someone who could sit in a coffee shop with a kind stranger and not have to worry about the consequences of that choice for millions of people." Marcus blinked. Millions of people. Zeph looked up sharply, as if he'd said more than he intended. "I spoke metaphorically. I simply meant that I sometimes feel the weight of others' expectations very heavily." Something in his tone suggested there was more to it than that, but Marcus didn't push. Everyone had their secrets, and he learned that sometimes the best way to help someone was simply to be present without demanding explanations. "Well," Marcus said, glancing at his watch and realizing with surprise that they'd been talking for over an hour. "For what it's worth, I think this has been the highlight of my week. It's nice to meet someone who asks real questions." Zeph tilted his head slightly. "Real questions?" "Yeah, questions about who you want to be, what matters to you. Most conversations I have these days are about homework or work schedules or whether the cafeteria food is getting worse. Don't get me wrong, that stuff matters too, but it's nice to talk about bigger things sometimes." "I find your perspective refreshing," Zeph said. "Most beings I encounter are eager to tell me what they think I want to hear." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." Marcus finished his coffee and realized with a start that Zeph's cup had been empty for quite some time. "Hey, can I buy you another drink? I noticed you finished that a while ago." Zeph looked surprised. "You would do that?" "Sure, why not? You've been great company, and Marcus paused, realizing he was about to admit to being financially strapped to someone he'd just met. But something about Zeph made him feel like honesty was not only safe, but necessary. "I've been having a pretty tough time lately, and this conversation has genuinely made me feel better. It's the least I can do." "You would spend your limited resources on someone you barely know?" The way Zeph phrased it made it sound like he was asking about more than just the cost of a cup of tea. Marcus shrugged. "My grandmother always said that kindness was the only thing that got more valuable when you gave it away. Besides, it's just a few dollars." Zeph stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus had the strange feeling that he was being seen in a way that was both comprehensive and gentle. It was like being studied by someone who was trying to understand not just what you were saying, but who you were as a person. I would like that very much, Zeph said finally. Thank you. Marcus got up to place the order, and as he waited for Jenny to prepare another pot of the herbal tea Zeph had been drinking, he found himself wondering about his new acquaintance. There was something about the way Zeph spoke, the careful precision of his words, the way he seemed to consider every response from multiple angles before speaking. It reminded Marcus of the way his international relations professor talked about diplomats, as if every conversation was a negotiation with stakes higher than they appeared. When he returned to the table with a fresh cup of tea, Zeph accepted it with what seemed like genuine gratitude. I must ask, Zeph said, wrapping his clawed hands around the warm cup. Why did you approach me today? Most humans, in my experience, prefer to maintain distance from those who are different. Marcus considered the question seriously. I guess because you look like I feel most of the time lately. Alone in a crowd, you know? Like you're surrounded by people living their lives, but somehow you're not quite part of it. He paused. Also, my grandmother used to say that loneliness was a disease that could only be cured by connection. I figure maybe we could cure each other's, at least for one afternoon. Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. She raised me after my parents divorced when I was 7. She died when I was 17, right before I started college. Marcus felt the familiar pang of loss that always accompanied thoughts of his grandmother. I try to live by the things she taught me, but it's harder than it sounds sometimes. And what did she teach you? That kindness costs nothing, but is worth everything. That everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about, so you should be gentle. That home isn't a place, it's the people who see you for who you really are and love you anyway. Marcus smiled. She was big on sayings like that. She said wisdom was too important to leave up to chance, so she made sure I heard the important stuff often enough to remember it. Zeph was quiet for a long time after that, staring out the window at the rain, which had finally started to slow. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that Marcus didn't quite understand. She sounds like she understood something that many leaders spend lifetimes trying to learn. What's that? That power without compassion is merely tyranny dressed in finer clothes. Marcus studied Zeph's profile as he spoke, noting the way his jaw tightened slightly, as if he was thinking about something painful. You sound like you've given that a lot of thought, more than I would like to admit. They finished their drinks as the afternoon light began to fade, and Marcus realized with regret that he needed to head home soon. He had a shift at the bookstore early the next morning, and he still had 2 assignments due that he hadn't started. I should probably get going, he said reluctantly, but this has been really great. I don't suppose you'll be around tomorrow? I usually stop by here around the same time. Zeph looked uncertain. I'm not sure how long I will remain in this area. Well, if you're still here tomorrow, I'll be at the table by the window around 3 o'clock. If not, I hope your travels go well, wherever they take you. Marcus stood and pulled on his jacket, then hesitated. Something about the way Zeph was looking at him, with what seemed like a mixture of gratitude and sadness, made him want to offer something more substantial than casual pleasantries. Hey, Zeph, I know we just met, and I don't know what kind of difficult decisions you're dealing with, but for what it's worth, you seem like a genuinely good person. Whatever you choose, I hope it's something that lets you be happy. Zeph's golden eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw something vulnerable flicker across his face. Thank you, Marcus, Zeph said quietly. Your words carry more weight than you know. Marcus gave him a cheerful wave and headed for the door, pulling his hood up as he stepped back into the drizzle. He walked home through the wet streets, thinking about golden eyes and careful words and the strange sense that he'd just had a conversation that mattered more than either of them had let on. Behind him, in the coffee shop, Zeph sat alone in the gathering dusk, staring at the empty cup that had been refilled by a stranger's kindness. In his long life, he had been offered tribute by conquered worlds, pledged loyalty by generals who commanded fleets of starships, and given gifts worth more than some planet's entire economic output. But he could not remember the last time someone had simply asked if he wanted company, and then listened to his answer without expecting anything in return. The pendant around his neck seemed to grow warm against his chest, responding to his emotional state in a way that his carefully maintained composure never quite managed to suppress entirely. Tomorrow, he would have to make contact with his fleet. Tomorrow, he would have to return to being Zephyros the Eternal, supreme emperor of the Draconic hegemony, ruler of more star systems than this young human species had even discovered yet. But tonight, for just a few more hours, he could sit in this small coffee shop and remember what it felt like to be simply Zeph, a traveler who had been shown unexpected kindness by someone who asked for nothing but offered everything he had. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean and carrying the promise of clearer skies tomorrow. Marcus arrived at Cosmic Grounds the next afternoon with cautious optimism and a stomach full of butterflies. He'd spent most of the morning thinking about his conversation with Zeph, replaying their exchange and wondering if he'd imagined the depth of connection he'd felt. In the bright light of day, it seemed almost impossible that a chance encounter with a stranger could have felt so significant. The coffee shop was busier than it had been the day before, filled with the usual mix of students cramming for finals and locals seeking refuge from the December chill that had settled over Syracuse overnight. Marcus ordered his usual elaborate coffee drink, his small financial rebellion for the day, and made his way to the table by the window where he'd promised to be. Zeph wasn't there. Marcus tried not to feel disappointed as he settled into his chair and pulled out his laptop. Of course, Zeph wasn't there. The guy had said he was traveling, that he wasn't sure how long he'd be in the area. It had been naive to expect him to show up based on one casual invitation from a stranger. He opened his thermodynamics textbook and tried to focus on the practice problems he'd been avoiding all week, but his attention kept drifting to the window and the steady stream of people passing by on the sidewalk outside. None of them had golden eyes or moved with that peculiar grace that had made Zeph seem somehow both ancient and timeless. Marcus was halfway through a particularly frustrating problem involving heat exchangers when a shadow fell across his table. He looked up, expecting to see Jenny offering a refill, and instead found himself staring into familiar golden eyes. "I hope I'm not intruding," Zeph said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he'd been debating whether to approach for some time. "Not at all," Marcus said, probably with more enthusiasm than was cool, but he didn't care. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." "Neither was I," Zeph admitted. He was wearing different clothes today, a sweater and jeans that fit him better than yesterday's expensive coat, though they still looked somehow formal on his elongated frame. "I found myself curious about our conversation yesterday. May I join you again?" "Please," Marcus said, closing his textbook and gesturing to the chair across from him. "Can I get you something to drink?" "That is not necessary. I am quite capable of purchasing my own refreshments." There was something slightly stiff in the way Zeph said it, as if he was unused to being offered things and wasn't sure how to respond gracefully. Marcus decided to interpret it as polite independence rather than rejection. "Of course. I just thought I'd offer. That's what friends do, right?" Zeph paused in the act of sitting down. "Friends? I hope we're friends. Or at least on our way to being friends. Unless that's presumptuous of me." "No," Zeph said quietly, settling into his chair. "It is not presumptuous. It is simply unexpected." Marcus watched as Zeph got settled, noting the way he moved with careful precision, as if he was always conscious of taking up space in a world that hadn't been designed for someone his size. Today, in the better lighting by the window, Marcus could see more details about his new friend's appearance. The scales that covered his skin were incredibly fine, creating patterns that shifted subtly as he moved. His eyes, which Marcus had thought were simply golden yesterday, actually contained flecks of amber and bronze that seemed to catch and hold the light. "So," Marcus said, after Zeph had returned with a cup of the same herbal tea he'd been drinking the day before, "did you sleep okay? Are you staying somewhere nearby?" "I have accommodations that suit my needs," Zeph said carefully. "And yes, I rested well. Thank you for asking." Marcus was getting used to the way Zeph spoke, choosing his words with deliberate precision as if he was translating from another language in his head before speaking. It made him seem formal but not unfriendly. "I'm glad. I was thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realized I never asked what you do for work. Are you in academia or business or? Zeph was quiet for a long moment, staring into his tea. I am in management. I oversee operations for a large organization. That sounds stressful. It can be. There are many people depending on the decisions I make, and the consequences of poor choices can be significant. You bet. I can barely manage my own life half the time, and I'm just responsible for myself and my goldfish. Marcus grinned. Well, mostly responsible. Poor Newton doesn't get fed as regularly as he should when I'm stressed about exams. Newton, my goldfish. I named him after Isaac Newton, the physicist. I got him during my freshman year when I was taking my first physics course and thought it was clever. Marcus felt slightly embarrassed explaining this to someone who was obviously more sophisticated than he was. I know it's silly, but he's good company. It is not silly, Zeph said, and something in his voice suggested he meant it. Companionship is important, regardless of the form it takes. Do you have any pets? Or I guess companions. I have advisors, Zeph said slowly. Individuals whose job it is to provide counsel and assistance. But I would not characterize our relationships as companionship in the way you mean. There's a loneliness in the way he said it that made Marcus's chest ache. He'd always been good at reading people, a skill his grandmother had told him would serve him well in life, and everything about Zeph's body language suggested someone who was surrounded by people, but fundamentally alone. That sounds lonely, Marcus said gently. It is the nature of my position. Personal attachments can complicate decision-making, or they can make decision-making easier because you have people you care about to consider. Marcus took a sip of his coffee and thought about how to phrase his next question. Can I ask what kind of organization you work for? Zeph hesitated. It is difficult to explain. We operate on a very large scale, with interests spanning multiple regions. I am responsible for ensuring that our various territories remain stable and prosperous. Sounds like government work. In a manner of speaking, yes. Marcus nodded. That explains the stress. Politics is brutal no matter what level you're operating on. My roommate's dad is a city councilman, and the stuff he deals with just for our little city is insane. I can't imagine what it's like when you're dealing with multiple territories. It requires difficult choices sometimes. Choices that not everyone understands or agrees with. Are you facing one of those choices now? Is that what you were thinking about yesterday when you said you were processing difficult decisions? Zeph looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. You are very perceptive. My grandmother always said I was a good listener. Sometimes people just need to talk things through with someone who doesn't have a stake in the outcome. Marcus leaned back in his chair. I'm a broke college student from Syracuse. I'm pretty sure whatever you're dealing with is completely outside my area of expertise, so you don't have to worry about me having an agenda. And if I told you that the decision I am facing could affect millions of people, that the wrong choice could lead to significant suffering. Marcus considered this seriously. Then, I'd say that sounds like an incredibly heavy burden to carry alone. And I'd ask if talking about it might help you think it through more clearly. Zeph was quiet for a long time, turning his cup slowly between his hands. Marcus waited, sensing that his friend was engaged in some kind of internal debate. There's a situation, Zeph said finally, involving a conflict between my organization and another group. The other group has acted aggressively toward some of our territories. My advisors believe that a strong response is necessary to prevent further aggression. What kind of strong response? Military action. A demonstration of our capabilities that would discourage future attacks. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. You're talking about war. I'm talking about preventing a larger war by ending a smaller conflict decisively. But people would still die. Yes, people would die. Zeph's voice was carefully neutral, but Marcus caught something underneath it that might have been pain. The question is whether more people would die if we act now, or if we wait and allow the situation to escalate further. Marcus took a deep breath. This was definitely not the kind of conversation he'd expected to be having over coffee, but he could see that Zeph was genuinely struggling with the decision, and that somehow made it feel important that he respond thoughtfully. I don't know anything about military strategy or politics, Marcus said slowly. But I do know that once you start a fight, you can't always control how it ends. My grandmother used to say that violence was like fire. It always burns more than you think it will, and it spreads faster than you expect. Your grandmother was wise. But what if the alternative is allowing innocent people to continue suffering under attack? Then, I'd ask if there were other options that hadn't been explored yet. Diplomacy, negotiation, finding out what the other side actually wants, and whether there's a way to give them some of it without giving up everything. And if they want something that cannot be given, if their demands are unreasonable or impossible to meet. Marcus thought about this, absently drawing patterns in the condensation on his coffee cup. I guess I want to know why they want those things. People don't usually start fights for no reason, even when their reasons don't make sense to other people. Maybe understanding what's driving them would help find a solution that nobody's thought of yet. You believe that every conflict has a peaceful resolution? No, Marcus said honestly. I believe that every conflict should be given the chance for a peaceful resolution before other options are considered. Maybe I'm naive, but I think most people want the same basic things: safety, security, respect, the chance to live their lives without interference. If you can figure out how to give people those things, maybe you can avoid having to fight them for them. Zeph was looking at him with an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read. And if your advisors told you that peaceful solutions have been attempted and failed, that the other side could not be trusted to honor agreements, then I want to know who made those attempts and how. Sometimes the people who are good at fighting aren't the best people to send to negotiations. Marcus paused, then decided to push a little further. Can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you want to authorize this military action? Zeph was quiet for so long that Marcus started to worry he'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. No, I do not want to authorize it. But I am not certain that what I want is relevant to what is necessary. Why wouldn't it be relevant? If you're the one responsible for making the decision, then what you think and feel about it has to matter. Because personal feelings can cloud judgment. Because leaders must sometimes make choices that go against their personal inclinations for the greater good. Or because leaders are human, well, you know what I mean, and their conscience is actually an important guide to what the greater good really is. Marcus leaned forward slightly. You said yesterday that you sometimes feel like you have to be someone you're not sure you want to be. This sounds like one of those times. It is precisely one of those times. Then, maybe the question isn't what you should do as a leader. Maybe it's what you would do if you were just Zeph, sitting in a coffee shop, trying to figure out how to solve a problem without hurting people. Zeph looked up sharply. That is a luxury that leaders cannot afford. Is it? Or is that just something people tell leaders to make them feel better about making hard choices? Marcus took a sip of his coffee, which had gone lukewarm while they talked. My grandmother used to say that the moment you stop seeing people as people, you've lost the right to make decisions about their lives. And what would she say about situations where any choice leads to people being hurt? She'd probably say that's when you need to be most careful about how you think about the people involved. When everything is terrible, the only thing that matters is how much you care about minimizing the damage. They sat in silence for a while, watching the students and faculty hurrying past the window. Marcus found himself thinking about the weight of the decision Zeph was facing, trying to imagine what it would feel like to know that your choices could affect millions of people. He couldn't comprehend it, really, but he could see the toll it was taking on his friend. Can I ask you another question? Marcus said eventually. Please. If you could send anyone to negotiate with the other side, anyone at all, who would you choose? Zeph considered this. Someone who could understand their perspective without being swayed by it. Someone who could find common ground without compromising essential principles. Someone who could speak honestly about difficult truths while still maintaining hope for better outcomes. That sounds like a very specific person. Do you know anyone like that? I thought I did. But the individuals I trusted to handle such negotiations have advised me that peaceful solutions are not possible in this case. Maybe they're right. Or maybe they're looking at the problem from the wrong angle. Marcus hesitated, then decided to voice a thought that had been forming. Would you be willing to try something that might sound crazy? I am listening. What if you went yourself? Zeph stared at him. I beg your pardon? What if, instead of sending someone else to negotiate, you went yourself? Not as the leader of your organization, but as someone who genuinely wants to understand what's driving the conflict. That would be highly irregular and potentially dangerous, but it would also be unexpected. And sometimes when you do something completely different from what people expect, you get completely different results. Marcus warmed to the idea as he spoke. Think about it. They're probably expecting threats or formal negotiations or military posturing. What if instead they got someone who showed up and said, help me understand what you need and why, because I want to find a way for everyone to get what they need? You are suggesting that I approach a hostile force with no protection and no guarantees of safety. I'm suggesting that you approach people who are probably scared and angry and feeling cornered with genuine curiosity and respect. It's amazing what happens when someone feels heard and valued instead of threatened. Zeph leaned back in his chair, and Marcus could practically see the wheels turning in his mind. It would be seen as weakness by many of my advisors. Would it? Or would it be seen as strength? It takes a lot more courage to walk into a room unarmed and ask hard questions than it does to send ships and soldiers. And if they refuse to listen, if they see it as an opportunity to attack, then you'll have tried everything before resorting to violence. And you'll know for certain that there really wasn't another way. Marcus met Zeph's eyes. But what if they don't refuse to listen? What if they're just as tired of fighting as you are, and they're waiting for someone to give them a reason to stop? Zeph was quiet for a very long time, staring out the window at the afternoon light beginning to fade. Marcus waited, sensing that this was one of those moments where silence was more important than words. It would require me to trust people I have no reason to trust, Zeph said finally. Yeah, it would also require them to trust you. That's what makes it potentially powerful. You'd be asking everyone to take the same risk. My advisors would be displeased. Are your advisors the ones who have to live with the consequences of whatever decision you make? We all have to live with the consequences. But you're the one who has to make the decision. And you're the one who has to look at yourself in the mirror afterwards and be okay with what you see. Zeph turned his golden eyes back to Marcus. You speak as if you have experience with difficult moral choices. Marcus laughed, though it came out a little shaky. Not on the scale you're dealing with. But I've had to make choices about what kind of person I want to be, and I've learned that I sleep better at night when I choose compassion over convenience. Even when compassion is more difficult, especially then. The easy choices don't define you. Anybody can be kind when it doesn't cost them anything. It's the hard choices that show who you really are. Zeph nodded slowly. Your grandmother taught you well. She tried to. I'm still learning how to apply the lessons. Marcus glanced at his watch and realized with surprise that they'd been talking for nearly 2 hours. I should probably let you get going. I'm sure you have important decisions to think about. Yes, Zeph said, but he made no move to get up. Marcus, may I ask you something? Sure. Why do you care what decision I make? You said yourself that this is outside your area of expertise and that you have no stake in the outcome. Marcus considered this, absently stirring the dregs of his coffee. I guess because I like you, and I want you to be able to live with whatever choice you make. And because if there's even a small chance that talking this through with someone who doesn't have an agenda might help you find a better solution, then it seems worth the conversation. Even knowing that millions of lives hang in the balance. Especially knowing that the bigger the stakes, the more important it is that every possible option gets considered, right? Zeph smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from him. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more approachable. You have an interesting way of looking at the world. My grandmother always said that the world had enough cynics and not enough optimists, so she was raising me to help balance the scales. I think she succeeded. They gathered their things and walked toward the door together. Outside, the early December evening was crisp and clear, with the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Will I see you tomorrow? Marcus asked as they stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop. Zeph looked up at the stars for a moment before answering. I'm not certain. I may need to return to my responsibilities soon. Well, if you do decide to try that crazy negotiation idea, I hope it goes better than anyone expects. And if I decide that my advisors are correct and military action is necessary. Marcus met his eyes steadily. Then I hope you find a way to make it as limited and merciful as possible. And I hope you remember that whatever happens next, you try to find another way first. Zeph extended his hand, and Marcus shook it, noting the careful way Zeph controlled his strength and the warmth of his scaled skin. Thank you, Marcus. Your perspective has been invaluable. Anytime. That's what friends are for. Marcus walked home through the crisp evening air, thinking about golden eyes and impossible decisions and the strange sense that he'd just helped someone change the course of history. It was probably just his imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. Behind him, Zeph stood on the sidewalk for a long time, looking up at the stars and thinking about courage and compassion and the young human who had somehow managed to see possibilities that seasoned military advisors had dismissed as impossible. Tomorrow, he would have to make his decision. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, he felt like he knew what he wanted that decision to be. Marcus didn't expect to see Zeph at Cosmic Grounds the next afternoon, so he wasn't disappointed when 3 o'clock came and went without any sign of his new friend. Instead, he settled into his usual table by the window with his thermodynamics textbook and tried to focus on the final exam that was looming in 2 days. The equations swam before his eyes, and he found his attention drifting to the conversation they'd had the day before. He hoped Zeph had found a way to navigate whatever impossible situation he was facing. Marcus had spent most of the night thinking about their discussion, trying to imagine what it would be like to hold millions of lives in the balance of a single decision. The responsibility would be crushing, and Marcus had a new appreciation for why his friend had seemed so burdened when they first met. He was deep in a particularly frustrating problem involving entropy calculations when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Marcus, this is Zeph. I wanted you to know that I took your advice. Thank you for helping me remember who I want to be. Marcus stared at the message, feeling a flutter of anxiety in his chest. He'd suggested that Zeph try negotiating personally with whatever hostile group they were facing, but now that he thought about it more seriously, the idea seemed reckless and potentially dangerous. What if he'd given advice that got someone hurt? He typed back quickly, I hope everything goes well. Stay safe. The response came almost immediately. I will do my best. Your friendship has meant more to me than you know. Marcus set his phone down with a growing sense of unease. There was something about the tone of the message that felt like a goodbye, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd encouraged someone to do something incredibly risky. He tried to return his attention to his textbook, but the equations might as well have been written in ancient Sanskrit for all the sense they made. 3 days passed without any word from Zeph. Marcus found himself checking his phone constantly and scanning the coffee shop every afternoon, hoping to see familiar golden eyes and hear that careful, precise voice explaining how the negotiations had gone. But Thursday came and went, then Friday, then the weekend with no sign of his friend. By Monday, Marcus was genuinely worried. He'd sent 2 follow-up texts asking if everything was okay, but received no response. He began to imagine worst-case scenarios. Zeph walking into a hostile meeting and being attacked or captured, or worse. The rational part of his mind pointed out that he barely knew this person and that whatever situation Zeph was dealing with was probably far more complex than he'd understood. But the part of him that had connected with those lonely golden eyes couldn't stop worrying. He was sitting in Cosmic Grounds on Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly studying for his final exams, but actually staring at his phone and willing it to ring when Jenny approached his table with a concerned expression. Hey, Marcus, there's someone here to see you. Marcus looked up, expecting to see his roommate or maybe one of his study group partners. Instead, he saw a woman he'd never met before standing near the counter. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a sophisticated bun, and clothes that screamed expensive and professional. Most striking were her eyes, which were the same unusual golden color as Zeph's, though her skin appeared to be human rather than scaled. "Marcus Chen?" she asked as he approached, and her voice carried a slight accent that reminded him of Zeph's careful pronunciation. "Yes, that's me. Do I know you? My name is Lyra Starweaver. I am an associate of Zeph's. He asked me to find you and deliver a message." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Is he okay? What happened?" Lyra glanced around the coffee shop, noting the other customers within earshot. "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private? This is a matter of some sensitivity." Marcus grabbed his backpack and followed her outside. She led him to a black sedan parked across the street that looked like something a government official might drive. The windows were tinted, and Marcus noticed with growing alarm that there were at least 2 other people sitting inside. "Before you start worrying," Lyra said, apparently noticing his expression, "Zeph is safe. However, the situation he was dealing with has become complicated. He wanted me to personally ensure that you understood what has happened." "What do you mean, complicated?" Lyra looked at him appraisingly, as if trying to decide how much to reveal. "How much did Zeph tell you about his work?" "Just that he was in management for a large organization, and that he was facing a difficult decision about how to respond to some kind of conflict." Marcus paused. He was trying to decide whether to authorize military action against a group that had been attacking his territories. "And what advice did you give him?" "I suggested that he try negotiating personally instead of sending representatives. That maybe approaching the situation with genuine curiosity about what the other side needed might lead to a different outcome." Marcus felt anxiety clawing at his chest. "Did something go wrong? Did I give him bad advice?" Lyra was quiet for a moment, and Marcus caught something that might have been amusement flickering across her face. "Mr. Chun, I need to tell you something about Zeph that he was not able to share with you directly." "Okay." "His full name is Zephyros the Eternal. He is the Supreme Emperor of the Draconic Hegemony, which controls approximately 40% of this galaxy's inhabited systems. The territories he was referring to included 17 star systems containing over 3 billion inhabitants." Marcus blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" The conflict he was facing involved a separatist movement that had been conducting raids on civilian populations in the outer systems of the hegemony. His military advisors had been recommending a large-scale military response that would have involved fleet actions across multiple systems and would likely have resulted in millions of casualties. Marcus felt like the ground was shifting underneath him. "You're telling me that Zeph is an emperor? Like, an actual emperor of star systems? The most powerful emperor in known space, actually. His word literally shapes the destiny of civilizations." But he was just sitting in a coffee shop drinking tea and talking about feeling lonely. "Yes," Lyra said gently. "He was." Marcus leaned against the nearest building, trying to process this information. "And I told the Emperor of half the galaxy to walk into a hostile situation unarmed and ask the rebels about their feelings?" "Essentially, yes." "Oh God, did he actually do it? Please tell me I didn't talk an Emperor into getting himself killed." Lyra's expression softened slightly. "He did do it, and the results have been extraordinary. He's not dead. Quite the contrary. The negotiations were successful beyond anyone's expectations. It turns out that the separatist movement was driven primarily by economic desperation and a feeling that the outer systems were being neglected by the imperial government. When Emperor Zephyros arrived personally to listen to their grievances, without military escort or formal protocol, it caught them completely off guard." Marcus stared at her. "It worked. It worked." The Emperor spent 4 days in direct negotiations with the separatist leaders. By the end, they had reached an agreement that addresses the economic issues driving the rebellion while establishing new oversight mechanisms to ensure better representation for the outer systems. What would have been a devastating war has instead become a comprehensive reform initiative. Marcus struggled to find words. "That's incredible." The Emperor's advisors are calling it either the greatest diplomatic breakthrough in hegemony history or the most dangerous precedent ever established, depending on their perspective. Lyra smiled. The emperor himself credits the success to advice he received from a wise friend who helped him remember that leaders are people first and position holders second. Marcus felt dizzy. I can't believe this is real. I assure you it is very real. Which brings me to why I am here. Lyra reached into her jacket and pulled out an elegant envelope sealed with what looked like metallic wax. The emperor wanted you to have this. He also wanted me to extend an invitation. An invitation? He would like you to visit the hegemony as his personal guest, to see the results of the peace process you helped make possible, and to meet the people whose lives were saved by your conversation in a coffee shop. Marcus took the envelope with trembling hands. The seal was warm to the touch and seemed to shimmer with its own internal light. I don't have a passport for interstellar travel. I don't think I could afford the airfare to the nearest spaceport, let alone passage to another star system. Transportation and all expenses would be provided, of course. The Emperor is quite insistent that you be properly honored for your contribution to galactic peace. My contribution? Marcus laughed, though it came out a little hysterical. I just listened to him talk and suggested he try being honest with people instead of threatening them. That's not exactly groundbreaking diplomatic theory. Perhaps not, but it was advice that none of his trained advisors had offered, and it led to a solution that saved millions of lives. The Emperor considers that contribution to be invaluable. Marcus opened the envelope with hands that were definitely shaking now. Inside was a letter written in elegant script that seemed to glow faintly on the page. My dear friend Marcus, I write this as I prepare to return to my duties, but I wanted you to know what has transpired since our last conversation. Your suggestion that I approach our adversaries with curiosity rather than hostility proved to be exactly the perspective I needed. The negotiations were successful in ways that surpass my most optimistic hopes. You told me that the world needed more optimists to balance the cynics, and you have proven yourself to be precisely the kind of optimist that can change the course of history. Your grandmother would be proud. I hope you will consider accepting my invitation to visit the hegemony. I would very much like to show you the peace that your wisdom helped create. But I understand if your studies and your life on Earth take precedence. Either way, please know that you have earned the eternal gratitude of more people than you can possibly imagine. Your friend always, Zephyros. Marcus read the letter twice before looking back up at Lyra. This is really happening, isn't it? It is really happening. And he really wants me to visit alien worlds because I bought him a cup of tea and told him to try talking to people. Because you saw him as a person rather than a position. Because you offered friendship without knowing what you might gain from it. And because when he asked for your honest opinion, you gave it to him even though it meant suggesting he do something that sounded dangerous. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Those are rarer qualities than you might think, especially in the circles where emperors usually move. Marcus looked at the letter again, then at the sedan full of people who apparently worked for an alien emperor, then at the familiar campus buildings around them. I'm a broke college student from Syracuse. I have finals next week, and I can't afford to miss my shift at the bookstore this weekend. I don't know anything about galactic politics or interstellar diplomacy. The Emperor is aware of your circumstances. If you choose to accept his invitation, arrangements will be made to ensure that your academic progress is not impacted. As for your job, Lyra smiled. I think you would find the Emperor to be a generous friend. Marcus thought about Zeph sitting alone in the coffee shop, looking lost and lonely despite apparently being one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. He thought about golden eyes and careful words and the weight of impossible decisions. He thought about his grandmother's voice telling him that kindness was the only currency that got more valuable when you spent it. Can I think about it? Of course. The invitation is open-ended. When and if you decide you'd like to visit, simply contact the number on the back of the letter. Transportation can be arranged within 24 hours. Lyra turned to go, then paused. Mr. Chun? For what it's worth, I have worked with Emperor Zephyros for over 50 years. I have never seen him as genuinely happy as he was when he spoke about your conversations. Whatever else comes of this, please know that you gave a very lonely person exactly what he needed when he needed it most. Marcus watched her get into the sedan and drive away, then stood on the sidewalk for a long time, holding a letter from an emperor and trying to process the idea that a casual conversation over coffee had somehow prevented an interstellar war. When he finally went back into cosmic grounds, Jenny looked at him with concern. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Marcus said, sinking into his usual chair by the window. He looked at his thermodynamics textbook, then at the letter that was still glowing faintly in his hands, then at his phone, which had a text message from his mom asking if he was eating enough vegetables. He thought about what his grandmother would say about this situation. She'd probably tell him that when the universe offered you an adventure, you should at least consider saying yes. She'd also probably point out that making friends with emperors was a good way to ensure job security after graduation. But mostly, he thought she'd be proud that her lessons about kindness and courage had somehow managed to prevent a war. Marcus pulled out his phone and started typing a text to his roommate. "Hey, can you feed Newton for a few weeks? I think I'm about to take a trip." Then he opened his laptop and started researching what one was supposed to wear when visiting alien emperors. He had a feeling his wardrobe was going to need some serious upgrading. Outside, the first snow of the season had started to fall, covering Syracuse University in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new and full of possibility. Marcus Chun, broke college student and accidental diplomatic advisor, watched the snowflakes drift past his window and wondered what adventures awaited him among the stars. In a command ship orbiting Earth's moon, Zephyros the Eternal stood before a massive viewport showing the blue and white marble of humanity's homeworld. His advisors had been debriefing him for hours about the implications of his unprecedented diplomatic success, but his thoughts kept returning to a small coffee shop where a young human had offered him friendship without expecting anything in return. The pendant around his neck pulsed with warm light, responding to his emotional state in a way that reminded him of Marcus's easy smile and genuine concern. Soon, he would return to the capital world of his empire, to endless meetings and formal ceremonies and the careful dance of interstellar politics. But he would also return with a new understanding of the power of simple human kindness and the knowledge that sometimes the best advice came from the most unexpected sources. And if he was very fortunate, he would soon have the opportunity to show his human friend the wonders of a galaxy at peace. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, bright with possibility and hope. 3 weeks after receiving the letter that changed his life, Marcus Chun found himself standing in a private spaceport outside of Geneva, staring at what appeared to be a small spaceship designed by someone with extremely expensive taste. The vessel was about the size of a luxury jet, but its hull seemed to be made of some kind of metal that shifted colors depending on the angle of view, and it hovered 3 feet off the ground without any visible means of support. "First time off planet?" asked Captain Naya Brightstar, the pilot who had introduced herself simply as one of the Emperor's personal transport specialists. She was humanoid, but clearly not human, with pale blue skin marked by intricate silver patterns that seemed to move subtly in the light, and eyes that were a startling shade of violet. "First time off the ground. Actually," Marcus admitted, adjusting the strap of his hastily purchased travel bag. "I've never even been on a regular airplane." Captain Brightstar smiled, revealing teeth that seemed to contain tiny points of light. "Well then, this should be quite an experience. Don't worry. Imperial transport vessels are equipped with the finest artificial gravity and inertial compensation systems in the galaxy. You won't feel a thing." Marcus had used the 3 weeks since Lyra's visit to finish his finals. He'd somehow managed to ace thermodynamics despite everything, arrange for a leave of absence from school for the spring semester, and have several increasingly frantic phone conversations with his parents about why their son was suddenly taking a cultural exchange trip to places that weren't listed in any atlas they could find. He'd also spent considerable time researching what little information was publicly available about the Draconic hegemony. Most of what Earth's xenological databases contained was diplomatic contact information and basic trade agreements. The hegemony was described as a stable imperial confederation with advanced technology and peaceful relations with humanity. What the databases didn't mention was that the Emperor occasionally visited Earth to sit in college coffee shops and wrestle with moral dilemmas. The inside of the spacecraft was even more impressive than the outside. The passenger compartment looked like the first-class cabin of the world's most expensive airline, if that airline happened to serve customers who came in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. The seats appeared to be made of some kind of adaptive material that molded itself to Marcus's body as he sat down, and the windows offered a panoramic view that was going to be incredible once they were actually moving. The journey to the Imperial capital will take approximately 18 of your Earth days, Captain Brightstar explained as she ran through the pre-flight checklist. The ship is equipped with recreational facilities, a full library of galactic literature in over 3,000 languages, and the finest culinary synthesis systems available. If you need anything during the flight, just ask Arya. Adia, the ship's artificial intelligence. Arya, please introduce yourself to our passenger. A warm, melodious voice filled the cabin. Hello, Marcus. I am Arya, the shipboard intelligence system for the vessel Starlight Express. I am here to ensure your comfort and safety during our journey. Is there anything you would like to know about the ship or our destination? Marcus said, feeling slightly surreal about having a conversation with a spaceship. How fast are we going to be traveling? We will be using a combination of conventional propulsion and dimensional folding to achieve an effective velocity of approximately 12,000 times the speed of light, Arya replied cheerfully. This will allow us to traverse the 1.7 million light-year distance to the Imperial capital in just over 2.5 weeks. Marcus stared out the window as the engines engaged with a barely perceptible hum. The landscape below began to shrink away, and within minutes he was looking down at the entire continent of Europe spread out like a map. By the time he'd processed that view, they were high enough to see the curve of Earth's horizon. It's beautiful, he whispered. The Emperor said you would appreciate the view, Captain Brightstar said. He requested that we take the scenic route through the Andromeda Transit Corridor so you could see some of the more spectacular stellar formations along the way. As Earth dwindled to a blue dot behind them, Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and terror that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. 2 months ago, his biggest concern had been whether he could afford textbooks for the spring semester. Now he was traveling faster than light toward the capital of an interstellar empire, invited by an alien emperor who had become one of his closest friends. The first week of the journey passed in a blur of wonder and information overload. Arya proved to be an excellent tour guide, pointing out notable stellar phenomena and explaining the basics of interstellar politics as they traveled. Marcus spent hours at the observation windows, watching nebulae and star clusters that humanity had only seen through telescopes pass by at impossible speeds. He also spent time in the ship's library, trying to learn as much as possible about Draconic culture and history. What he discovered was both fascinating and sobering. The Draconic hegemony had existed for over 3,000 Earth years, growing from a single world empire to a vast confederation of species and star systems. They had a reputation for fair governance and technological advancement, but they were also clearly a military power that other civilizations treated with considerable respect. Emperor Zephyros himself was something of a legend. He had ruled for over 800 years, having ascended to the throne at what was considered a young age for his species. Under his leadership, the hegemony had expanded peacefully through diplomacy and trade agreements rather than conquest, earning him a reputation as one of the most effective leaders in galactic history. The Emperor is considered quite young for a Draconic ruler, Arya explained when Marcus asked about this. Most emperors don't take the throne until they are over 1,000 years old. Emperor Zephyros was only 200 when he inherited the position after his father's unexpected death. 200 years old is young. For a species, yes. Draconic lifespans are measured in millennia rather than centuries. The Emperor is currently around 1,000 years old, which would be equivalent to perhaps 35 in human years. Marcus tried to wrap his mind around the idea that his friend was a 1,000-year-old alien emperor who was still considered to be in his prime. It explained the sense of ancient wisdom he detected, but it also made their friendship seem even more improbable. As they traveled deeper into hegemony space, Marcus began to encounter other vessels. Trade ships heading toward the galaxy's outer rim, diplomatic couriers carrying messages between worlds, and sleek military patrol craft that kept a respectful distance from the obviously Imperial transport. Each ship was different, representing the incredible diversity of species and cultures that made up the hegemony. I had no idea there were so many different kinds of people in the galaxy, Marcus told Arya as they watched a convoy of crystalline ships that looked like they were made of living gemstones. The hegemony currently includes representatives from over 400 different species, Arya replied. One of Emperor Zephyros's greatest achievements has been creating a governmental structure that allows for such diversity while maintaining stability and cooperation. On the 10th day of their journey, Captain Brightstar announced that they were approaching the first of the inner systems. Marcus pressed his face to the observation window and gasped. Ahead of them lay a star system that looked like it had been designed by an artist with unlimited resources and no concern for the laws of physics as he understood them. 3 suns of different colors, one golden, one blue-white, and one deep red, orbited each other in a complex dance that painted the surrounding space in shifting patterns of light. Dozens of planets and artificial habitats dotted the system, connected by streams of light that Marcus realized must be some kind of transportation network. Space stations the size of cities hung in the void like glittering jewels, and ships of every conceivable design moved along invisible highways between the worlds. "Welcome to the Thyralis system," Captain Brightstar said, one of the major commercial and cultural centers of the inner hegemony. "We'll be stopping here briefly to pick up an additional passenger." The additional passenger turned out to be Lyra Starweaver, who boarded with a warm smile and what appeared to be several pieces of luggage that contained their own gravitational fields. "Marcus, how are you enjoying your first interstellar journey?" "It's incredible," Marcus said honestly. "I don't think I've processed half of what I've seen so far. Arya has been trying to educate me about galactic politics, but it's like drinking from a fire hose. That's perfectly normal. Most beings require several months to adjust to the scale of interstellar civilization." Lyra settled into the seat across from him with the easy grace of someone who had traveled between stars thousands of times. "I thought you might like to know that the Emperor is very much looking forward to your arrival. He has planned quite an itinerary for your visit. I still can't believe this is really happening. Every time I think I've wrapped my mind around the situation, something new happens that makes it even more surreal. Such as the fact that I'm sitting on a spaceship with an artificial intelligence named Arya, traveling faster than light toward a planet I can't pronounce the name of, to visit an alien emperor who rules hundreds of star systems, but still remembers how I like my coffee." Lyra laughed, a sound like silver bells in a gentle breeze. For what it's worth, the emperor finds the situation equally remarkable. In all his years of rule, he has never encountered someone who could offer such profound advice while remaining completely unimpressed by imperial power. "I wasn't unimpressed. I just didn't know he had imperial power to be impressed by." "Exactly. You treated him as a person first, which is something that happens very rarely in his position. Do you know that in the formal court protocols, there are 17 different ways to address the emperor depending on the context and the speaker's status? You called him Zeph and asked if he wanted company." Marcus felt his cheeks warm. "I hope it wasn't disrespectful." "I didn't know. It was the opposite of disrespectful. It was exactly what he needed." Lyra leaned forward slightly. "Marcus, may I tell you something about Emperor Zephyros that might help you understand why your friendship means so much to him?" "Sure." "He became emperor when he was very young by the standards of his people. His father died in an accident, and suddenly a young scholar who had been studying philosophy and literature found himself responsible for the welfare of billions of people. He has spent 800 years making decisions that affect entire civilizations, surrounded by advisors and courtiers and diplomats who see him first as an institution and only secondarily as a person." Marcus thought about this. That sounds incredibly lonely. It has been. Oh, he has advisors he trusts and respects, and there are family members and old friends who care about him. But even they approach him with awareness of his position. Every conversation is filtered through the knowledge that they are speaking to the emperor. Until he met a college student who didn't know who he was. Until he met a college student who saw someone sitting alone and offered to share a table. Lyra smiled. The emperor told me that in your first conversation, you asked him what he would choose to be if the choice were entirely his. Do you know how long it had been since anyone asked him what he wanted rather than what he thought was necessary? I'm guessing it had been a while. Over 200 years. Not since he was crowned. They spent the remaining week of the journey talking about the hegemony's history, its culture, and its challenges. Lyra proved to be an excellent teacher, with a gift for explaining complex political situations in terms that made sense to someone whose only experience with government was voting in college student elections. Marcus learned that the emperor's decision to negotiate personally with the separatist movement had indeed been unprecedented, and that the success of those negotiations was already having ripple effects throughout the galaxy. Other conflicts that had seemed intractable were suddenly being approached with new diplomatic strategies. Several minor wars had ended in negotiated settlements rather than military victories. You have to understand, Lyra explained, the Emperor's reputation for fairness and integrity is one of the hegemony's greatest assets. When he does something unprecedented, it carries enormous weight throughout the galaxy. The fact that he achieved peace through personal diplomacy rather than military force has fundamentally changed how other leaders think about conflict resolution. I never intended for any of this to happen, Marcus said. I just thought he looked sad and could use someone to talk to. The best changes often come from the simplest motivations. On the morning of the 18th day, Arya's voice woke Marcus from sleep. We are now approaching the Imperial capital system. You may want to observe our arrival from the main viewing lounge. Marcus made his way to the front of the ship and joined Lyra and Captain Brightstar at the large observation window. What he saw took his breath away completely. The capital system contained a single massive star surrounded by 7 worlds, each one clearly visible as a distinct, inhabitable planet rather than a distant point of light. But what made the view truly spectacular were the orbital installations. Vast cities floated in space between the planets, connected by bridges of light that spanned distances that boggled the mind. Ships moved along these bridges in steady streams, creating patterns that looked like the circulatory system of some enormous living creature. And at the center of it all, orbiting the star itself at what should have been an impossible distance, was a structure that defied every assumption Marcus had about what was possible to build. Is that a ring around the entire sun? He asked in amazement. The stellar ring, Captain Brightstar confirmed. The ultimate achievement of draconic engineering. It's a continuous habitable structure that completely encircles the star, providing living space for over 2 trillion beings. 2 trillion. The Imperial capital is the largest single population center in the known galaxy, Lyra said. Representatives from every member species live and work there. It's considered one of